is Norm Volsky, your host, and this is the Digital Health Heavyweights podcast.
Thanks, Norm. It's an honor to be here, and it's been fun to work with you over the years.
Hello, and welcome to the Digital Health Heavyweights podcast with your host, Norm Volsky. Today, we are thrilled to be joined by Elina Onitskansky. Elina is founder and CEO of Ilant Health, a value-based obesity management and cardiometabolic health solution. Elina previously served as the SVP and head of strategy at Molina Healthcare and was an associate partner at McKinsey. So, Elina, welcome to the podcast and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Norm. Excited to be here.
Excellent. So, for all of those that don't know Elina, Elina is a strategic advisor for Syncare and 28 Health, was recently named as one of the top 50 in the digital health system disruptors. Very passionate about combining the power of analytics, clinical care, technology to innovate obesity and cardiometabolic health. Elina also has an MBA from the Harvard Business School, has an AB in chemistry and physics from Harvard. I'm really excited to jump in and explain what she's doing in a very, very hot space.
Thanks, Norm.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Elina, you've been in healthcare for a long time. What incentivized you and motivated you to, spend your career in healthcare?
Yeah, so it's funny. I started out like many folks out of college as more of a generalist, and then actually coming out of business school was sort of like, hey, where do I want to pick my spots? And I picked healthcare for two reasons. One, it's obviously sort of something that's deeply meaningful and something where I felt like, hey, I had family who are doctors. I had obviously lots of family affected by health. And so that was meaningful. But then I say this jokingly, I felt like it was so messed up that there were always going to be opportunities, right? Forget what share of GDP it was. I'd done some work in industrials and consumer when I was earlier in my career. And you were trying to move the needle like 1% on cost of a screw or something like that. And in healthcare, we just had things that were fundamentally not working. And so I thought, regardless of where it took me, when you had something that was sort of this large, this meaningful, and had so many opportunities, there was going to be lots of places to play a pretty meaningful role.
And, talk about a space that, needed a lot of innovation and a lot of new fresh blood and ideas. Obesity management, is an epidemic in this country. The pandemic even, exacerbated the issue that, we already had as a country. And now with, the launch of GLP-1s, like the whole market is just kind of seeking counsel and how to manage this specific population within an employee population or health plan population, how to help and support this group. So there's a lot of companies that have entered this space. There are a handful of incumbents that kind of changed business models a little bit. Tell me about your company and what you and your company is doing that's vastly very different from a lot of what else we see in the market.
Yeah, so I think at a very fundamental level, the company came out of, in some sense, like my unique background, which is professionally in healthcare for a really long time, personally affected by obesity. But I would say where this came out of is having been a health plan executive, having been in the healthcare industry, I very fundamentally felt that any solution that was going to have long-term traction had to be one that worked for employers and health plans, right? That basically worked within the system. And the only solutions that work within the system are sort of value-based. And let me sort of break down value-based because unfortunately, I think we've started to use value-based in the same way that beauty contestants used to talk about world peace, which is people say a lot of things and then they put value-based at the end. And you're like, I don't know what any of those prior things had to do with value-based, but I recognize that you recognize that there's something good about value-based care and have added those words. But in my world, what does value-based mean? It means that you are driving great member experience that is supporting engagement. It means that you're driving clinical value and health outcomes. And in addition to that, you are driving a financially compelling solution. And I think that third piece is often the missing leg when I look at sort of digital health innovation. And in this space, it's, hey, I need it to work for the member, I need it to work clinically, and I need it to work financially. And so we've actually come up with an approach that does all three. So I think
Hmm.
early on when I was starting to innovate in the space, we saw a lot of direct to consumer solutions that I would say were very focused on getting medications to people. And so we're
Hmm.
maybe very focused on one version of that member experience. And then I think more recently, we've seen solutions come in that are essentially step therapies and are saying, I have a better approach to utilization management and are just solving maybe some part of financial. When we talk about value based, we're really saying, how do we de average care to get the right member, the right solution with the right level of support? And that involves for us a couple things. One, obesity is just like any other part of healthcare where the cost, 80% of the cost, right, is driven by, let's call it 20% of the population, right?
Hmm.
And so a really important part is how do you engage that very high, how do you identify and how do you engage that very high acuity population? In obesity, particularly hard because there is so much shame and stigma, because historically undercoded, and so a lot of our analytics are actually focused on that element. And I don't think you can drive a financial solution if you don't engage the highest acuity individuals. The second part of that for us, Norm, is like, how do you get people to the right solution? And so I think in many cases, I now feel like most solutions are either GLP-1s for all or GLP-1s for none. To me,
Yeah.
like neither makes sense. So I look at obesity, it's 50% of the US population. The idea that that can be solved, like cancer is a much smaller part of just about every other condition is a much smaller part of the population. If I went to you and I said, we're going to solve all of cancer with X diet or Y drug or Z procedure, you'd be like, that doesn't make any sense, right? Why would
Yeah.
that be true? And yet in obesity, there's this deep belief that if only we found the miracle diet, and believe me, personally, I have searched for many a miracle diet or the miracle drug or the miracle procedure. And like, I think GLP-1s are transformative. I think the evolution of bariatric surgery has been a game changer. I think we know a lot more about nutrition than we did 15 years ago. And still, there's like no one size fits all solution. You've got to match people to the right treatment. And so that continues to be, I think, like in some ways, a not a common perspective, which is continues to be very odd to me, but I think speaks to the fact that even sort of solutions in this space in some sense exhibit some of what I like to call like diet culture, right? Which is like
Hmm.
every diet I've ever done was sort of structured as you're going to do this diet, a miracle will happen, you will become normal, and then like it's all over, right? And so I think we've got to move to this world where it's not a diet, it's not a miracle, it's sort of figuring out how you solve for individual folks. And then look, the final piece to me, and I know the Peterson study really sort of poked at this, is I love that we have digital health innovation. I'm obviously in the digital health space, but I think just because we're innovating digitally doesn't mean you like sort of throw out the baby with the bathwater and all of the high touch care. And
Hmm.
I think one of the errors that was made was in the excitement at getting away from fax machines and doctors' offices that never called you back and having things like remote patient monitoring and chatbots and AI and all the things that we're excited about, like those are all supporters and enablers of still good clinical care. And so to me, that last piece that's so important for us is how do you make sure you're supporting people, right? You got the right people, you got the right treatment. None of that matters if they don't sort of do the treatment, if they don't feel supported. And, I hate to say it because I do think there is so much technological improvement needed in healthcare, but like the solution is not going to be an AI chatbot sitting by itself. It may be an AI chatbot like that occasionally pushes people to a physician, but I think we got very excited by this idea that like, oh, look, it's not a fax machine. And at the end of the day, humans still need humans, right? And it's
Yeah.
sort of how do we empower all of them? So you got maybe more of an answer than you wanted there.
No, it's fantastic. So you don't have the traditional background of a startup founder. The last two companies you worked for are like the literal textbook definition of big corporate. So let's start at the beginning and kind of work our way to, where you are now. What made you decide to join McKinsey? And tell me about that experience.
Yeah, so I would say, the short answer would be that, I wanted to work right on interesting problems. I wanted to learn from smart people. The longer answer is, I was in college when I first went to McKinsey and I thought I was going to be a research scientist. So I worked in
Mhm.
a clean room doing, frankly, quantum physics and working on quantum dots. And here's the thing I realized, if you're a giant extrovert, which I am, working in a clean room 12 hours a day is actually not a great fit,
Mhm.
because the beakers don't talk back. And if they do start talking back, like something went really wrong. And so it's funny, I started that because I was, very interested in science, very interested in fundamental research. And then very quickly realized like I couldn't do that for life. Like I needed
Uh-huh.
way more human interaction. And if I'm not going to be a research scientist, what are interesting things I can do? And, like all college students at that time, was very exposed to consulting and banking, and realized like consulting was super interesting for me because
Mhm.
I liked working on big problems. I liked working with smart people and I liked the idea of sort of learning, right? And it felt like, hey, I'd spent a lot of my time in a lab. I'd sort of read the Wall Street Journal for fun, but I wasn't a business major. Like, where was a place I could go and learn? And McKinsey was compelling for that.
And walk us through how you moved from different industries and eventually like found a foothold in healthcare.
Yeah, I mean, it was a random walk, right? So I did both when I was in consulting and in private equity. Like I was an analyst and associate, and those are random walk experiences. So you sort of go to whatever study or a deal is next. And I think that's great because I do think sort of the older I get, like as much as I love data and analytics, there is so much value to pattern recognition and
Mhm.
developing that pattern recognition in yourself. And I actually think working across industries, particularly if you're going to land in healthcare, is helpful because, like,
Mhm.
in healthcare, you can use pattern recognition from other industries, from 5 years ago. But I think for me, I'd always worked on what I thought were big problems, whether that was in physics as a researcher or sort of what attracted me to McKinsey or other places. I wanted sort of large problems that I sort of felt like were hard to solve, right?
Mhm.
And so as I worked in different areas, it felt to me like healthcare was one of those largest sort of problems hard to solve. And I would say like both from a quote unquote altruistic standpoint, but also very much from like a practical standpoint, I felt like any area that had a really massive problem where the solution was non-obvious was going to create opportunities to sort of, take leadership roles, innovate, whatever it was. And so I sort of ended up in healthcare for both sort of like, it was meaningful, but also felt like there was just going to be endless opportunity.
Yeah, I think like the McKinsey alumni network's probably as successful as just about any alumni network out there. What did you learn in your time there that really helps make you a better like CEO and founder now?
Yeah, I would say maybe two things. One, that just about any problem is solvable because you're constantly thrown at stuff. And what feels on week one completely impossible by like, week four, you're like, okay, I got this.
Hmm.
I think that's one. I think the second thing I learned is the value of starting from first principles. And I will also say, like, I also deeply believe that from physics. So physics is so much about like, can you set up the problem? Can you understand the basis? I think that really worked well. And then, the third one, interestingly, is like the value of listening to experts who've been in it for a while. So I would say, when you're an early analyst, I think sometimes you're like, oh, I can totally solve this from my Excel model and like basic principles. And then you go talk to a client who's been in it for 20 years and they're like, that's not going to work. And look, like sometimes they're wrong, but a lot of times they're actually right. And like you just didn't think about, well, when you do A, then B happens, and that drives three other things. And so I do think there's a lot that you learn in that power of first principles to solve problem, but also like how important it is to like listen, understand expert perspectives and sort of, take that into account. And I'll be blunt, when I look at a lot of digital health innovation, I feel like there's a lot of folks running in being like, everyone in healthcare doesn't know what they're doing. And you're like, guys, it's a fifth of the US economy. Do you literally think every existing human here has never had a good thought? And there isn't enough, hey, let me try to understand why do people sitting in the seats that they sit in act in the way they do, what's going on, and then how do I sort of solve with that understanding in place.
Yep. That's always a good way to, you know, think before addressing an audience is like, okay, if you're sitting in their shoes, like what's going through your mind? What are your concerns? What's the things they're trying to accomplish and just, try to match up as best you can to solution sell them if you think it's a good fit. Walk us through you choosing to make the jump from partner at McKinsey to lead strategy at Molina. What inspired you to, leave consulting, which is a very like sexy job, and move over to the health plan side that, might not be as, exciting to some.
Yeah, no, it was a particular opportunity at Molina. So I had mentioned before, I like really big, complex, hairy, tough situations. And Molina at the time was going through a transformation. And you'd had a complete changeover in leadership. You had a new leadership team coming in to a company that was, frankly, struggling. And to me, that was like how exciting to basically come in first head of strategy, develop the first ever corporate strategy for them and like
Hmm.
have impact on a Fortune, I think 150 company, right? To really sort of help steer that direction. So to me, that was sort of the piece that was exciting, right? And I think that I've always sort of wanted impact, right? I think like no quote unquote job is sexy in and of itself. It's like, hey, are you doing things on a regular basis where you're like, hey, that's really interesting. I'm doing something pretty impactful. And I just could not think of, anything that would be more impactful in that moment than actually helping to turn around a health plan that had millions of people and often some of the highest need individuals that relied on it for coverage and for,
Yep. And you mentioned before, you probably came in with all these types of ideas, and then once you're sitting in the seat, you're like, oh, there are some constraints that, like, if you aren't in the health plan, you wouldn't know they exist. What were some of the like wide-eyed moments where you're like, this is why things are the way they are in the healthcare system?
Yeah, so I would say two thoughts. And one, Norm, you'll appreciate this from your role is like, when you're in consulting, there's always people available in some sense, right? Not like the day after, but if you need to staff a team, there, you can usually get it done in a week or two because, like, literally the job of a consulting company is to have humans available to staff projects, right? When you're trying to do something new at a health plan, there's no people sitting around where you can be like, oh, we're going to transform X or innovate Y. Like, let me staff these folks on. You either have to pull them from other places, right? And it may or may not be a great fit, or you have to like staff from scratch, and that takes time. And so I think I coming from consulting and private equity, where there's like literally always folks available to do XYZ, like
Hmm.
that was, I would say, a realization of what it's actually like in corporate, right? Which is like there's a resource and there's the same resource constraint on IT. Like you want your project put in, like where does that slot in relative to like many other competing priorities?
Hmm.
Um, and then look, I think the other thing that, is hard to appreciate if you haven't sat at a massive corporate is like everything is built on a certain infrastructure. So, like moving things, right, requires understanding how that infrastructure works and actually understanding all the implications. Okay, you're affecting IT. Does it affect quality? Does it affect care management? Does it affect,
Hmm.
network operations? And so I think a lot of times, large organizations, we often complain health systems and health plans are slow moving, and they are. Look, some of that is aversion to change and all those pieces, but some of this is like they're very large, complex organizations where any given action probably has like four more implications than you may have initially sort of thought about.
Okay. And, after your time at Molina, what gave you the idea to start Ilant?
Yeah, I would say like all good HBS case studies. I was sitting on the beach in Florida looking out into the distance. It'd been a couple years after I struggled with obesity since I was a kid. I tried literally everything out there, right? There was not an exercise trend I hadn't tried. There wasn't a diet I hadn't tried. There wasn't a weight loss spa I hadn't tried. And actually, when I was still at Molina, I, finally, quote unquote, gave up, referred myself into bariatric surgery and obesity medicine. And I came out of that journey for the first time ever, having lost over 100 pounds sustainably.
Hmm.
And that said, it was Thanksgiving. I have family in Florida, so I was visiting them and literally sitting on the beach. And for the first time in my life was like not obsessed with, oh my gosh, like how much do I need to work out if I'm going to have Thanksgiving dinner? And I sort of had an aha moment, which is like, I've seen this movie before. It's mental health 10 years ago. It's substance use disorder 5 years ago. It's sort of maternal health and fertility 7 years ago. And I sort of felt like we needed a better solution because as transformative as my journey had been, I got terrible support during it. So
Hmm.
I don't know if someone who hadn't come from my background, who wasn't health educated, who couldn't sort of look up papers by themselves would have been as successful. And so I sort of was sitting there on the beach being, oh my gosh, like I can't believe I've been living this journey in parallel to this sort of healthcare career that I literally was contracting for. How do we get the right mental health support? How do we help individuals with chronic care conditions? And like not recognizing my parallel journey.
Yeah.
And when I had that realization, I felt very strongly about what the right solution in this space would be. And just to provide an early hint, I did not think it was a direct to consumer
Hmm.
GLP-1 for all fast path. And so I looked around and sort of said like, well, gosh, if I had done more research in my own journey, was there going to be better support out there? Did I just miss it? And the answer was no, right? Like
Hmm.
I didn't see any good solutions. And more than that, I didn't see anyone out there that was solving the problem. You barely solving the problem for members, certainly not solving the problem for employers and health plans. And I didn't feel like you could have any solution in the space that didn't actually, address the payer angle, that wasn't sort of enabling care at scale, that couldn't integrate with the health plan, that wasn't financially viable. And so I set out to create it.
All right, walk us through the patient journey. You mentioned like the experience you had very little, any support, bad support, however you described it. How is the experience without Elant, and what is the experience with it?
Yeah, so look, I think the experience without a launch is that most people spend a lot of time searching. They do it under a tremendous amount of shame and stigma, often with existing clinicians supplying some of that shame and stigma. So, I had great healthcare, right? I had great insurance. I went to marquee clinical institutions. And no physician ever told me to do anything other than eat less, move more. And I was already moving quite a bit and knew every salad in like a 5 block radius from where I worked and where I lived. But I think that's par for the course, right? You don't get great care. You feel really embarrassed. People tell you it's your fault. And you do a lot of sort of searching, in secret, and then when you do go on to a program, there often isn't support. So even, I landed in surgery and obesity medicine, right? I was still navigating most of that by myself, right?
Mhm.
I was sort of figuring out what did I need to do before, what did I need to do after. I mean, I remember my support was like a set of pages that seem to be photocopied from other photocopied pages, which, is consistent in healthcare, right? There was like,
Mhm.
okay, good luck. Here's like the answer. It's a set of photocopied pages. And again, I'm pretty health literate. So I was like, okay, like, I guess this is what it means. But I don't think it was easy for anyone, much less if you think about social determinants of health or folks that are not, as health educated, don't have as much access to research. So what do we do differently? So I would say, first of all, it starts with our initial outreach. I obviously have lived experience in obesity. Many other folks on the team do as well. We're really focused on non-judgmental engagement. So I don't know that people appreciate how impactful that is, because when we talk to employers and health plans, people will say like, well, why do you guys think people are engaging with your program? What are you doing differently? And they often focus on like, what's the channel? What are the touch points? And I actually think people sometimes miss how impactful the tone, especially in an area like obesity, which I hate to tell you is
Mhm.
like probably the last thing in the world that not only are you allowed to discriminate on, like you're encouraged in some sense. Like I've heard physicians say that we need to motivate people to lose weight, and that's why we judge them to motivate them to lose weight. And like for anyone thinking that, like, I hate to tell you, but everyone with obesity is aware that's not like a gosh, like, should I have obesity or should I be thinner? Like, no one out there is asking that question. But I think
Mhm.
the fact that we still have discussions about like easy buttons and not letting people take the easy route and encouraging them to do hard work tells you how judgmental baseline communications are. So for us, like the starting point is we're super non-judgmental, right? So our
Mhm.
outreach, we're like obsessed with what's the language we use and how do we make sure that there's nothing in what we say that makes someone feel like they're going to be judged, right? So that's a really core part of our outreach, and we sort of maintain that in our eligibility where we enable confidentiality, right? You don't need to use your employer email. There's lots of things we do to sort of make it safer for people to
Mhm.
feel like, hey, is this a program for me? And then when we initially engage an individual, we do it through a lived experience peer navigator. And that's so important to building trust. You
Yeah.
know, so that's sort of the front part of our model. And then we do use analytics, clinical decision support, AI, right, to basically match people to the treatment that's right for them together with our obesity medicine physicians. So we're leveraging technology and expertise to get people to the right treatment. But then what's really important is when they're on treatment, they're incredibly supported. So every single member on our program sees an obesity medicine clinician, a registered dietitian, a mental health clinician, and that lived experience peer
Mhm.
navigator. We maintain touch and then we really adjust to the needs of the members. So if you're struggling, we're going to come in and we're going to try to help. And I would say just one example that's different. So food logging, everyone has food logging. Well, here's like a nuance on how we do food logging a little differently. Yes, we ask you to sort of log some of your food. I will tell you, as someone who's done just about every diet program, I really don't care if someone had 6 cherry tomatoes or 10 cherry tomatoes, because I
Mhm.
can tell you there is not a dietitian on the planet who'd be like, man, like we really got to get the number of cherry tomatoes someone eats right, because Lord knows those extra 4 tomatoes build up over time to too many calories, right? I actually care a lot more. How did you feel about what you're eating? Because I think people often miss that piece. If you haven't done diets, and this links to this idea of like just try hard enough. Yes, if you're having pizza every day, we'd like to have a discussion about maybe better choices that, you can adopt. Also, if you're having a salad every day and you're miserable, like that's not going to continue, right? At some
Mhm.
point, you're just going to say, like, no, like I don't want to stare at my food unhappily every day. And so we actually want to intervene earlier for that and say, okay, what's going on? What do you not like about the salad? Have you thought about, different things? And so I think that's just like one very tangible example. But for us, the focus is you've got to get people on the right people. You've got to get them to the right solution, but you've also got to support them, and you have to support them as humans, right? And humans have ups, they have downs, they, have bad days, good days. Like it's really important to be able to support people as people. And so I think that's a big part of, the experience with us, which is we're very there. We are giving you good guidance, but we're also trying to do that in a super non-judgmental and like very practical way.
I love that. I see a lot of parallels into what you're doing in your niche and what I've done my whole career. People will ask me like, "Hey, what's different about your firm than others?" And sometimes you can say like, "Hey, we worked with these clients. We've had this many success stories. We have these." None of that necessarily all matters. It's like, how do the candidates and then our clients after the fact like feel about the interaction? If one recruiting firm is like very high pressure and doesn't really sound like they care about the person's career, what they want, they're just trying to like fit square pegs in round holes. The person feels that, and that's something they're never going to forget. Same type of thing, like if they work with a firm that like really cares about them, making sure they find a really good fit, want it to be a good fit for all parties, take themselves and their own incentives out of it, and make it all about, hey, how can I help you? What are you looking for? what does that look like? And like, when would that make sense? Not saying like, oh, it's now or never. All those things compound into building a relationship where you can actually help someone because you're coming from a place of wanting to help as opposed to just like pushing an agenda. So I think, that is very, very telling and something we spend a ton of time training our newer team members on like how to really come to work every day and be like low pressure and all about like, hey, take myself out of it. Let me help anyone I'm working with. And if they're happy and the other side's happy, everyone's going to be in a good space at the end of the process. So makes a ton of sense. How does Elant partner with employers and health plans to create effective and value-based obesity management? Like walk us through once an employer or health plan signs on the dotted line, what happens after?
Yeah. So, by the way, I love what you just said, because I think what you said to me is alignment, right? Like you've got to basically align so that everyone does well in the same scenario. And to me, like even going back to earlier in our conversation, that's about like when value-based care works, that means not everyone gets everything they've ever wanted in exactly the way they wanted it, but actually everyone is doing better in the state you're in. And so to me, that's sort of the depth, like when you get this right, there's a tremendous amount of alignment. So members get great care, they get great outcomes, employers get happy members, and also financial value. And like, because we're making that work, we reap financial value. And you're not reaping the value at the expense of the member and employer. You're reaping it because you're sort of, creating aligned value. So I love that. In terms of sort of, an employer, right? So we start out really trying to understand, maybe probably similar to you, the needs of our employer and health plan clients, right? What are you trying to solve for? What does your population look like? What conditions do they have? How long do they stay with you? What is sort of the current GLP usage? What are the outcomes you're trying to drive? Because I do think, maybe going back to my consulting roots, like I do think the best sales here are consultative, right? You're actually co-creating these programs. So we have a core belief on what works. That comes from a ton of research and evidence base. But ultimately, it's got, just in the way that we are talking about, it has to work for the member. It's got to work for a given employer. I've talked to employers where their average tenure is 10 years. And I've talked to employers where their average tenure is 2 years. Like it's very reasonable that those two employers are going to have slightly different ways that they're going to approach a solution. There's nothing wrong with that. It's how do you support people in the best way possible within that construct. So that's sort of what we do. We then basically figure out with them what are the right marketing channels, right? So what's the program we're going to put in place to solve your needs? In most cases with an employer, we do like to be the single front door to treatment, which means that you can only get anti-obesity medication like a GLP if we prescribe it.
Yeah.
Part of that is to manage the cost. Part is to manage the experience for the member. So we do see people coming into our program that got prescriptions from someone else and they were never coached on anything to do with nutrition. They never got any support for side effects. So to us, like having us be sort of that exclusive provider creates value for the employer and for the member. And then we work on how do we engage members? What's the right plate? What are the right channels to get the word out? How do we partner? By the way, what's the right language to use in your environment? What are words that are meaningful in your culture? What are not? And so then we partner to sort of roll out a program. But like to me, that's just the starting point. From there, what we really focus on is I am a data nerd. So we do love data. What's happening in your population? How do we share back that data? And again, that to me is a big part of alignment, but also like we're all rowing in the same boat, right? So if things are not going well, I want you to know, let's figure out how to solve them together. We didn't get, the engagement that we wanted, or, we're seeing, not doing as much nutritional activity, or we see lower knowledge of physical activity that we'd want. How do we sort of partner to solve that? And how do we create a lot of transparency around what is happening in the population? Because I think one of the things that's so powerful here is people with obesity have so often not gotten good engagement that we'll see people coming in that don't engage with the rest of the system. They don't use any benefits. They don't see a PCP. And that actually is a different insight. That creates an opportunity for us to sort of support the employer in demonstrating to those individuals the other programs that are out there, and helping actually sort of for that employee reinforce the value proposition of whether that's the employer or the health plan. And so we try to really use data and open communication sort of on the front end, right, to get the right program, to get the right structure, but on the back end, to actually make sure we are driving those results.
So this very customized support, this very thoughtful language when reaching out, the financial model that you explained was a differentiator. Like, what is that resulting with in terms of outcomes at the end of the day? Throw
Yeah.
some
So,
stats at me.
all right. So I told you at the beginning, what's the goal of our model? The average care, right members, right solution, right
Hmm.
support. So I'll just sort of walk through each of those. So on right members, we see a lot of high acuity engagement. So obesity is for everyone 30 BMI and above. By the way, standard disclaimer, BMI is just one metric. It's just easy at the
Yeah.
population health level. But obesity is 30 BMI and above, GLPs and other anti-obesity medications approved at 27 BMI and above. Most of the cost sits in over 40 BMI. So just to give you a
Hmm.
sense of that, someone with, let's say, class 1 obesity, so 30 to 35 BMI, is about 1.3 to 1.5 times more expensive than someone at optimal or normal weight. Someone at class 3 obesity, so 40 BMI or above, is 2.5 times more expensive. So,
Hmm.
and again, like that shouldn't be surprising. That's just healthcare, right? In some sense,
Yeah.
like higher, acuity is always sort of exponentially higher cost. So for us, it's really important that we engage those 40 BMI. It's really important that we engage, over 35 BMI, right? The majority of our folks are over 35 BMI, and we're treating today from 27 BMI to 80 BMI, right? And so our
Hmm.
ability to engage very high acuity folks, so important. And I would say not just from a financial standpoint, but from the standpoint that like those individuals cost more because they have more comorbidities. It affects their lives. We have folks that are homebound due to obesity.
Hmm.
That is devastating. And so that's a really important part for me on piece one around sort of engaging sort of the right people. Piece two is, are we aligning treatment? And I would say, Norm, to your point earlier, I don't believe in GLP-1s for all. I don't believe in GLP-1s for none. And I also deeply believe that people understand when you're trying to quote unquote trick them. So,
Yeah.
I would say trick them or sort of make things hard. So I do not believe that everyone should be on a GLP. I also don't believe that really abrasive step therapy is going to get outcomes that people want, because when people basically feel like it's a game, right? Like, hey, you can get what you want if you sort of hit the first three balls in succession, right? They no longer focus on like, should I get the thing over here? They're just like, how do I hit the balls, right?
Hmm.
And so we've turned healthcare into some version of an arcade game where people feel like it's how do I get what I want as opposed to like,
Yeah.
what should I get? And so our model is not step therapy. It is this clinical decision support enabled individualized matching. So we focus on how do I get someone to the right solution early on? And that means for some people, you go to metformin. And for other people, you go to a GLP. And for another person, you go to a bariatric surgery. And for another person, it may be intensive behavioral therapy, right?
Yeah.
And the idea is like, how do you get the right people there? And what we're really happy about is what we're seeing is acuity matching. So my folks over 40 BMI are largely going to bariatric surgery and GLP-1s. And my folks under, 30 BMI are largely going to other anti-obesity medications and intensive
Hmm.
behavioral therapy. And we're doing that without step therapy, without abrasion, but at this very analytical sort of AI and sort of human touch driven model. So I would say that piece is one of our biggest differentiators and is so important because you've got to get people to the right solution. And then the third piece is that member engagement and support and adherence. And so on that piece, we also feel really good. We're driving world-class weight loss results we're seeing our weight loss numbers as sort of on par or above GLP-1 for all shops, even though, as I said, we have a range of solutions. And then we're seeing high NPS scores and we're seeing member adherence. So I think adherence is an area that has really taken a hit. You've seen Prime come out, you've seen BHI come out and say people are not adhering to treatment. That's not our experience. And look, part of that is I think we try to make sure early on that people understand the treatment they're going on. So we do not put people on a treatment we don't think they're ready for. We make sure they understand implications, right? That if you're going on, if you come off, you may regain, here's the implication. And then we support them day in, day out on treatment. So I would say, as I look at sort of our goal, which was that sort of de-averaging care to drive better value, we're hitting that on all three dimensions.
Yeah, I all of a sudden saw some parallels. I've seen a couple of versions, of this type of like show on the streaming services, but I'll use one example, like on Hulu, Dope Sick, which was about the opioid epidemic. And I think, a lot of patients in that show, there's a lot of examples and, overlap, but, they had an intended goal in going to the doctor. They wanted to get prescribed opioids. Like, they're like, oh, I'm in pain, I want this. There's some similarities right now with like drug seeking behavior where there's some people determined, like they've already decided in their mind, like, I want GLP-1s. Like, who is a doctor that will prescribe those to me, with the least amount of vetting or, hoops to jump through before just getting the, yeah, here you go, like, go get it type of thing. So I think like it's a very unique thing in our society of patients and people, hearing someone in their social network of like having something or having a certain result and then determining, oh, that's what's going to be best for me, already preconceived to like go in and like that some certain thing is going to help them. So instead, in that example, like if someone is going through pain, being open-minded, going to a physician they trust to be like, hey, like, should I start with physical therapy? Are there other like things I can do? And that's the last resort, same type of thing here.
Yeah, Norm, one distinction, I think if you look at sort of people who are seeking, they were addicted at that point in time, but I do think there's this idea that like when you get, I often joke like TikTok is not a prescribing engine. It's not a doctor. So we've got but I would say, yes, that was sort of drug seeking behavior driven by an addiction. I do think there's something different here, which is I do think we're seeing quote unquote drug seeking behavior, but I think you've got to get under that. And what you have to get under is say like there is a group of individuals that either feel like they've tried everything known to man and are frustrated and it seems like there's something out there working, or frankly, their obesity, as we talked about earlier, highly stigmatized. So there's a group of folks that feel whether they have obesity or not, that their lives would be better if they were smaller. Right. And by the way, that like holds true, not only if you have obesity, but if you're, you're a size 8 and you want to be a size 2. And I think like it's really important to sort of understand what is driving the desire and try to solve for that need of that individual without judgment, right? Because both situations of like, hey, I've tried everything, I'm super frustrated, or even the other element of I feel like I would be treated better if I were smaller, like those are real needs. And I would say it's sort of like, how do you help someone feel like you're solving their need, but not necessarily by giving them the thing they came in wanting? Said another way is, again, this is linked to that non-judgmental, it's linked to the personalization. One of the things we try to do is get to know members really well early on. So if we're saying to them, no, we don't think you should be on a GLP, it's not because like policy 11.7.G.I.C says that in order to get a GLP, you must fail off metformin followed by 3 months of whatever. Like that doesn't make anyone feel human. That it's like, hey, based on your medical record, prior experience, everything we've run, we think that you can be successful on this treatment. Here's why we think it's better for you. Here's why we think it's going to help you be sort of healthy. And
Mhm.
by the way, like one of the things we're really focused on, we don't have goal weights. It's not about the number on the scale, right? It's about, we have one member, she was able to ride an amusement park ride with her son, right? It's like, what are you
Mhm.
trying to do? Are you trying to be able to pick up your grandkids, like run up the stairs without breathing hard, right? Like maybe even sort of feel better, sort of walking around. Like, but I think it's really important that we try to engage people on what's meaningful for them, make sure that what we're doing is meaningful for them, right?
Mhm.
But I do think we are seeing quote unquote drug seeking behavior, but I think we're seeing it because people have so struggled with this for so long.
Mhm.
And this feels like it's going to work. And I think the engagement here is not to say, like, no, you're a bad person for wanting it. Here's a policy that's going to make it really hard for you to
Mhm.
get it, or stop asking for the easy button. It's actually to say, let's talk about you. What are you trying to
Mhm.
accomplish? What is your health? What have been your prior experiences? Like, how do we solve for you and make you
Mhm.
successful?
Recently, you closed, I believe last month, a $2.5 million extended seed round. Obviously, congratulations.
Thank you.
Very unique environment, to fundraise right now. You were successful doing it. What advice would you give to founders who are looking to raise funding right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think the most important thing is to actually find investors that are aligned with you and where
Mhm.
you sort of have similar beliefs, similar principles. And I think that's important, particularly in an environment like this one. So, I actually come at that belief from having been on the other side, having worked as an investor, having been a senior advisor to investors. And I think ultimately there's often too much focus on what's the dollar that I'm getting and not enough focus on, like, is this someone who believes in my approach, who
Mhm.
understands what that means and is aligned? And so I think it's really important, even in an environment like this one, to really focus on that alignment. Because to be honest, we talked about earlier alignment with members and employers and health plans. You can't have that alignment if you don't have alignment with your investors, right? If your investors want
Mhm.
exponential revenue growth by every single person who's ever wanted a GLP, that's going to be really hard to roll out a value based approach, right?
Yeah, very, very insightful. How's the proliferation of GLP-1s entering the market changed the obesity management space?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pulled forward discussion so much. So it's interesting when I was starting the company a couple years ago, I went and I talked to a bunch of folks at health plans, a bunch of actuaries, and at the time, GLPs were not super prominent. People had like no idea about obesity, right? They barely knew what percentage of their population had obesity. Like
Mhm.
half of them didn't even remember that there were treatments for obesity other than diet. And so I think GLP-1s have materially increased the awareness of health plans and employers on obesity. That's in some sense the good news. The thing that sort of scares me is there are so many, I don't want to call them bad actors, but let's say near term focused actors in this space, which are very much like, hey, how much money can I make? And I actually think these companies are giving most people who are looking for help sort of like a quote unquote bad name, because I think you look at what our members, you even look at surveys, most people with obesity are not drug seeking, they're not solution, they're
Mhm.
looking for help improving their health and they're open to it. But I think unfortunately, some of what's going on in this space is not necessarily conducive to those types of long term solutions. And I'm really
Yeah.
hopeful we sort of don't have that type of bad behavior affect the ability of basically 100 million plus Americans to get the health
Yeah.
care that they need.
And I misspoke earlier when we were talking about the parallels between the like movie documentary. I think what was most striking in that was that the pharmaceutical companies were pushing it and influencing doctors to prescribe more than they wanted or more than they felt comfortable, based on either flawed data or purely misleading or, pressuring them in other ways. And I think that's probably the best parallel between that issue and epidemic, along with what's going on now, is just as you said, there are some bad actors that aren't necessarily looking, to what's the best thing for this population over the next 30 years. It's like, oh, everyone wants to buy this. Like, let's
Now, yeah. So I
monetize it
used
as
to
much as
sell
possible.
X boom solution and now I sell this. A couple months ago, I think one of the large, it was either Wall Street Journal or New York Times came out with new insights like not everyone on a GLP loses weight. And you're like, this isn't new insight. This was literally published in the clinical trials. And so when I talk about de-averaging, right, Matt, you've got to look at it, the complexity. It's not about an average number. It's like what works for that person. I think a lot of time in our TikTok world, there isn't
Yeah.
the ability to engage on that like much more nuanced level of like, hey, it's not like everyone get on X pill or Y diet, same, I will call out the keto diet, right? Works for some, not for all. We've got to stop pushing one solution, whether it's a drug or a diet or a surgery or God knows what else, and actually get to that much more nuanced approach. And I agree with you, Norm. The space for that type of nuance can be hard to construct in some areas.
Oh, 100%. Um, any, insight onto what the next 5 years is going to look like for Elant and like any, goals or predictions of what the future will hold?
Yeah, I mean, look, we expect to be sort of the enterprise solution for obesity. And I think the
Mhm.
way we're going to do that is through high quality, high value care. And so for us, that's focusing on getting the right folks to treatment. It's about using data and analytics and technology. And it's actually about publishing studies that sort of show outcomes that are differentiated relative to sort of standard of care. So I think we're going to continue pushing to sort of be the solution that solves the obesity epidemic in a way that is sustainable for members and for employers and health plans.
I ask everyone who comes on the podcast, I think it's really important that us, people who are in the industry practice what we preach. How do you reduce stress and, how do you like balance running a company, trying to help all these people, but also knowing that you can only help people if, you're in a good space yourself from a stress standpoint.
Yeah, look, the biggest one for me, and I learned this, is I have a very clear circadian rhythm. I prefer to be asleep by 10:30 and up at 5:30 or 6. And no matter where I go, I try to stick with that. So you find me on the West Coast, like going to sleep at 7 p.m. because,
Hmm.
that's sort of my rhythm. So I think that one's really important for me. And then the other one for me is I'm a giant extrovert. And so people and my
Hmm.
friends give me a lot of energy. And so one of the things I actually did very early on is I got off of nearly all social media because what I wanted to do is for whatever free time I had, I wanted to be calling my friends, seeing my family, going out to lunch, dinner, going for a walk in the park, not sort of scrolling social media. And so I think those are the two things that for me sort of make sure that I sort of stay even keeled and keep my energy up.
I like that. And you mentioned that this was a journey for yourself that you first went through before, helping now thousands and hopefully in the not too distant future, millions across the country. I ask everyone like any healthy recipes you make at home that might inspire someone to try something new and, add something to their group of things they eat on a given month.
Yeah, so there's a quote unquote pancake recipe that I like a lot, which is it's a banana, like a very well done banana. Like you probably wouldn't want to eat it.
A lot of dark spots
Yeah.
on it.
Peanut butter or almond butter and an egg, and sort of like you mix that up and make smaller pancakes, but there's no sugar, there's nothing in it, like because the banana gives you that flavor. It's very high
Mhm.
protein because of the peanut butter, almond butter, and the egg. And, it's sweet and sort of like very filling. So that is often a weekend treat for me.
All right. And just quick health tip for everyone else watching, make sure it's all natural, 100% peanut with a little bit of salt, not the Jif or Skippy that has 15 grams of sugar in every 2 tablespoon
Fair enough.
serving
Yes.
size.
Fair enough. Yes.
Yep. Because that's another thing that's
Yeah.
hard and unique is like a recipe will say like peanut butter and it's like, oh, I have peanut butter. I don't have to buy anything. And it's like, oh, you gotta kind of make sure it's the right, style and, without additives and preservatives and all that type of thing. So again, Elina, really, happy to have you on the podcast. This was excellent. Thank you so much for joining. Congrats on your and Ilant's success. And we're very eager to, continue to watch you guys thrive. So again, thank you for joining us on the Digital Health Heavyweights podcast, and, good luck.
Thanks, Norm.
Thank you for joining. Please like, comment, and subscribe below if you enjoyed it.